Hi, everyone. Mike White here. Welcome to this week's blog post. It's another week in the books, and I think we've been through these cycles enough times that we should be used to them. And the more we go through them, the more I still am shocked and surprised, although I shouldn't be, at the fact that, volatility in the marketplace is something that we're going to deal with perpetually. And the reaction to information or the prognostication, if you will, as to what things mean or how markets are going to react to them, I think continues to expand the more that we've got, all of this information available in social media with all these different people who offer, I guess the word is expert advice as to what's going on. And I maintain myself that I remain largely data driven. I have resources that I use to look at information. Um, we've talked here before a number of times about how certain data that comes from the government or certain reports that are put out there are generally well behind where the markets truly are. And when you combine that with instant gratification of how markets have knee-jerk reactions. And one of the things that we always have to remember is the fact that the markets often react more to emotion than they do to facts, and that perception often creates and shapes reality, especially when we're talking about the bond market. And you've got to be prepared to know what's happening and when things are going to happen, and you know actually listen to what gets said or read what's actually written, and then step back and take a look at it. And nothing could be more true than probably the last 4 to 6 weeks in the world, I guess, to be honest with you, because it wasn't that long ago that, and again, we've all just lived through this. The past few weeks, we had these stories about how, tariffs, they drove the stock market. Tariffs were going to kill the world. Everything was going to come to a screeching halt. And the stock market plunged down below or down to 38,000 in the Dow. And people were rushing to liquidate their assets before the big crash was going to happen. And look at your 401ks, and now you've lost all this money. And I was like, you didn't lose anything if you didn't sell anything. Your 401k is still sitting there. And remember, even at 38,000, it was higher than it was, a few years ago. So the reality of it is you don't lose because the stock market goes down if you didn't sell anything. And if you're selling because you have a fear of what's happening as opposed to have made an educated decision, then chances are good that you're going to be standing back just now and looked at, oh, by the way, Dow Jones Industrials has recovered significantly. We're above 41,000. So for all those people that were panicking as the Dow dropped, and now we're a few weeks later and we're above 41,000, you rushed to the emotion, you got buried in stuff when that fall and recovery was just a blip on the radar. And at the same time, the bond market, where we're specifically tied to, right? It was bouncing around like crazy. The 10-year Treasury, for example, on April the 4th, the 10-year Treasury hit a low of 3.86%. And the experts, quote unquote experts, were calling this the beginning of another refinance boom. And we're going to, this is the beginning of lower interest rates. And, it's, the whole thing about, the the fact that, rates were going to go lower. And within a week, we were up at 4.59%. And the same experts were sitting there talking about the collapse of the bond market, and there's going to be, this was going to be a catastrophe. And This morning we're going to open up at 4.31, right? And so all of that panic, all of that, you know, all those issues with all these things. And again, last week we had again, with the tariffs, we got these tariffs and we got it. Oh, we got the economic numbers and GDP was down and we're going to go into this recession, if not a depression, and there's going to be no toys for kids for Christmas and no trade deals are going to happen. And the world was sitting back saying, China was going to be the new economic engine of the world and the United States was done. And it's just beyond me that when you don't step back and realize that in any of these situations, the golden rule applies. The person with the gold gets to make the rules. And in this scenario, when it comes to trade and when it comes to the world economy, the people who are spending the most money are the people that are really in control of what goes on, even though it may not appear to be. And one person that I saw said, a former Fed governor who said yesterday on CNBC was, well, I'm not overly concerned about some of the things that people are worried about. You've got to remember that the US economy, about 80% of the economy is made up in service related items, not in, things that are manufactured. And so, yeah, if tariffs increase the cost of some goods and things like that, yes, it would be, certainly a challenge that prices you could see the cost of things changing, but it's just changing in that one area of something that is much larger. Now, again, everybody's entitled to their opinion, and for sure, the Fed chairman yesterday, and again, this is the guy that said inflation was transitory and by spending, $3 trillion, it was going to reduce inflation. And okay, we can get all past that. But even he said, what, we're not doing anything. We don't have enough data to make any decisions. We're going to let this thing play out and we're going to see what happens with these trade deals, what the impacts, where do we land? And again, same time he's saying that, White House put out a statement that we've got a big trade deal being signed at the White House this morning. Treasury Secretary is heading to Switzerland this weekend to meet with the Chinese about, putting together a trade deal with them. There are, people that we know. There are other trade deals that are in the mix. Some companies have already made decisions and have moved things around. And, the reality of it is, a week ago, two major entities in this country were talking about a second quarter decline in GDP, which would trigger a recession. That was last week, and yesterday they put out forecasts saying that they expect the economy GDP to grow by 2% or more in the second quarter. In a week, we went from we're going to be in a recession to we're going to have 2% plus growth. Again, you've got to take a breath with these things. You've got to understand that the real estate market, mortgages, is a very simple thing if you look at it from the big picture standpoint. People buy and sell houses regardless of the circumstance. I've told you my first loan that I wrote back in the early 1980s was 15 7/8 and 5 points, and we had to wait 3 days for the wire to show up, and everybody was thrilled. Houses were being sold, and people were buying them, and they were borrowing the money. They were figuring it out because ultimately shelter and housing is something everybody has to have. New families are created every day, just like unfortunately people die every day. These things happen. And when you're in a market where there are less housing than there are people who need it, the pressure is always going to be there for things to happen. So you've got to take a breath here, and you've got to just remember the main rule that I have for all my clients. If the payment works, if they can afford the payment, if they're comfortable with what the payment is on the house, it doesn't matter what the rate is. It matters that they get into the house with a payment that they can afford. Because down the road, if interest rates go lower, they can refinance and they can save themselves some money. On the other side to that coin is once they're in the house, they've locked in the value of that house, they've locked in a place that they want to be in, they've locked in their cost on that property. And if rates go higher, then they got one hell of a deal. Either way, the client wins. Either way, it works out. Because ultimately, it's about can they afford the payment? Is the payment for them worth what they're getting in that house? And if the answer is yes, I love the house, it works for me, it functions for my family, and I can handle this payment, then guess what? Go ahead and do it. And if down the road rates go lower, you can refinance. And if they don't, you made a hell of a deal. So as always, understand the markets, understand where you're getting your information, try to stay out of the emotion, the ebbs and flows. This is going to continue. It's going to be, a volatile ride, and you have to be prepared for it, not to get wrapped up in it, to guide the process for yourself, your team, your clients, your referral partners. And as always, if you have any questions, it's Mike, impcoaching.com. We'll talk to you again next week. Take care.